Hello again, and we start our panel on Vajrayana practices, the origin and classification. And our panelists are David Germano and Geoffrey Samuel. And I want to introduce them. David Germano, professor from the Department of Religious Studies and Director of Contemplative Studies Center at University of Virginia. And David is also Director of Contemplative Sciences and founder of Tibetan and Himalayan Library. He's doing research on contemplative practices and specifically on tantric practices. And our other panelist is Geoffrey Samuel, professor from School of Religious and Theological Studies and Cardiff University, and University Buddhist Education Foundation, and visiting professor at the University of Sydney. So Geoffrey and David will be moderating this session. And so we will be collecting questions from the audience. And I will be monitoring Q&A and also very welcome questions from our panelists as well. So Geoffrey, maybe you can start in just a bit about your work and tantric practices, and we'll start our discussion about tantric practices, what they are, and how they different from meditation of other traditions.
Okay, well, just to introduce myself a little bit more, my background's really in anthropology, in social and cultural anthropology, a bit also medical anthropology, and so my initial approach to Tibetan Buddhist practice was very much that of what these practices are doing as part of Tibetan society, as part of Tibetan culture. At the same time, I was obviously quite interested in the practices in their own right, and have been involved to a certain extent at a practice level over the years with them. So I've become progressively more and more interested in how one might understand these in the scientific mode. I have some background in the natural sciences before I became involved in anthropology. And so when I encountered Maria's work, I found it extremely interesting. We've been talking for some years on and off about her research, and been involved in a workshop together in Switzerland and met in Sydney and in Singapore and so on. So that's really that's a kind of brief indication of where I'm coming from. At the same time, I find this whole question of what is it exactly that we're looking at here quite a complex one. That's partly why I'm looking forward to this question about what is meditation, how do we define it, how do we understand it, because I feel that's something that is in some ways very much an open question here, and inevitably everybody is approaching it in a slightly different way. Okay, well, I'll stop there perhaps.
And I watched your presentation and David's presentation, and they were actually both referring to meditation as extremely complex thing, and it's difficult to even define how we're going to define meditation. But what do you think, David and Geoffrey, what do you think about whether we can call Vajrayana practices such as deity yoga or like deity yoga generation stages or Tummo, can we call those practices meditation, whether they even meditation from a more traditional perspective or more the yoga practices? Of course, it's how we define meditation, but then the question whether they have more in common with other types of Buddhist practices, or they have more differences, or they're very different from them. So what do you think about it?
Do you want, well, I'll go ahead for a little bit. I think the term meditation as a general term in English has got a very complex history, and most of what it referred to until certainly until you get the research agenda starting with people like Herbert Benson in the 1960s, was referring to something quite different from what we're talking about here. And the whole development of this idea of Buddhist meditation, I think, has rather blurred the fact that most meditation was conceptual, not non-conceptual, that it was not aimed at the kind of things that Buddhist meditation, at least, is described as being aimed at. We found ourselves, I mean, Benson, of course, tried to conflate all of this stuff together, and at times he writes as if Sufis, shamans, Christian meditators, Kabbalists, Hindus, Taoists are all doing the same thing, you know. And I think clearly that's, to put it mildly, a drastic oversimplification. Nevertheless, I mean, we do have the possibility of looking for common processes at a physiological level, which is what you've been doing here. I find, I mean, for me, in some ways, this is a bit of a non-question, in that I think to be focusing too much on is this meditation or not isn't particularly helpful. But it is clear within the Buddhist context, where you have, and I think David's laid this out very well in his talk, where he's given us this quite spectacular classification of both classification of different stages of Tibetan types of Tibetan meditation, and also laid out a lot of the individual factors that one might have to bear in mind in looking at what's really going on in these practices. I think we do have in the Tibetan context both specific terms for particular kinds of practice, deity meditation and deity yoga and so on. We have this fairly generic term yoga. We also have nature. We have perhaps more generic term again, gompa, bhavana in Sanskrit, which might be glossed as meditation in English, but then this is already becoming a bit circular. So there is a sense of both a wider range of practices which belong together, and various specific practices within that. And if we look at that wider range of practices that belong together, then I think it's clear also that many of the things that go on in non-Tibetan traditions also belong in there as well. I think there has been a history of defining meditation in ways that exclude those, exclude a lot of this kind of thing. I was looking, for example, at Roger Welsh and Shauna Shapiro's definition, which some of you may have come across, which this describes meditation as a family of self-regulation practices that focus on training attention and awareness in order to bring mental processes under greater voluntary control and thereby foster general mental well-being and development and capacities such as calm, clarity, and concentration. When this comes in, for example, it's been they've published this in various places, most recently in the Handbook of Transpersonal Psychology. But they then go on to say one of the main benefits of this definition is that it permits for an efficient differentiation between meditation as a pure practice in attentional training from related activities. And when they go on to talk about the related activities, it turns out that a lot of the Tibetan practices would fall under those related activities. Anything to do with breath manipulation, body postures, movement, the contents of awareness, visualization are actually being deliberately excluded here. Now, I find that that kind of approach is quite unhelpful. I mean, working from the other side, because it's essentially saying that a very narrow range of practices is appropriate to be considered here, and various other things which we don't like because they're not pure enough, or they introduce other elements are not. And yet it seems quite clear within the Tibetan context that these practices all kind of feed into each other in different ways. I think that's one of the really nice things about particularly your most recent work in Bhutan, where you get a sense of what happens when you're doing deity yoga before and after other forms of meditation, how it feeds into the Mahamudra type practices and so on. I mean, this is one of the things I was trying to talk about a bit in my preliminary lecture two, or talk two, the sense that we really have to look at what is going on as part of the total program. And I mean, that's very much what the Tibetan Lamas are saying to us too. I mean, the whole idea of a 3-year retreat and all the things that are going on within it, or of the, you know, the way that things are set up in a community like Gebchang, is premised on whatever it is that is being done here, requiring this kind of wider context and the interplay of all sorts of various elements. So I think we just have to find ways of categorizing which can accept that and work with that, because that's what it's about. Yeah. David, would you like to?
Yeah, sure. I mean, in some ways, that's one of the small things that I was trying to address in the presentation I give, but maybe I can restate that in a slightly different way. The first, and just in terms of 5 frameworks that kind of came to mind, Maria, when you asked that question. The first one is what Geoffrey started out with, which is we could look at meditation as an English word and trace its historical pedigree. And that pedigree includes the last 50 years in North America and elsewhere, how the term has been used with a variety of contexts, including attempts to understand Buddhist practice. And that history is kind of very variegated. And so I'm not going to say much about that, except that I will say I completely agree with Geoffrey that when people offer normative definitions in English like Walsh and Shapiro, they go completely astray. And I find them not only helpful, but actively distorting. Secondly, we could look, when we're asking this question of Tibetan sources, and see what terms do they use. And of course, a lot of their terms, and in fact their main normative terms to talk about different forms of religious practice, are direct translations of Sanskrit sources. So they have a word that I think we would most typically think of as meditation, which is gom. And the other term, which means cultivation, it means habituation, it means to, it's more in that family of meanings. The other term that's used very widely in a very broad sense is to take into one's experience. It literally means take into one's experience, but it's clearly often used as a synonym with meditation. And we can also look at terms that Tibetans offer that are not meditation. And one of those, and these can get very problematic because the boundaries are not that clear, but one is they do have a word for ritual. And they often differentiate so-called meditation from ritual activity. Although the truth is, a lot of the meditative practices are intensely ritual, and a number of the ritual practices are very meditative. And some of the most famous Tibetan meditative practices, such as deity yoga, are also some of the most complex ritual practices. Another term they often use to differentiate from meditation is conduct. So they'll say meditation and conduct. And conduct is different kinds of things that you can do at the level of your behavior in a day-to-day life, and they won't call that meditation, they'll call it this word conduct. And then also study, they'll typically differentiate from meditation. And so what I tried to offer here was also a way that Tibetans contextualize meditation in different kinds of rubrics. And so I'll just mention a couple of those. One is the ground, path, and fruit. And so the ground is kind of where we start from. our human existential starting point or some deeper starting point. And then the path is all these practices that take us from that starting point to this outcome that we want to achieve. And in the Tibetan Buddhist context, that outcome typically is associated with enlightenment. And so that path is not meditation, but meditation is one of the main elements of that path. And so they talk about the path's 3 trainings. And those are, it's a very old Buddhist concept in India: moral conduct, contemplation, and wisdom. But in another scheme that Tibetans have, they talk about view, meditation, conduct, and fruit. And in that context, the path is basically meditation and conduct. And then view is the philosophical study and orientation, and fruit is the outcomes that you're generating through these practices. So there we have a sense of the practice, the path, as a really overarching central kind of concept of Tibetan Buddhism, and different ways to parse that out. But one is its contemplation, wisdom, and moral conduct. Another one is its meditation and conduct. And so in this context, contemplation is really synonymous with meditation. Another important kind of rubric they use is how to study. And when they talk about how to study, it's these 3 phases. You listen, you hear the studies, and then you kind of analyze them or interpret them, and then you meditate upon them. And so that's also another sequence in which represents a kind of dominant way in which meditation is understood by Tibetans. And a couple of other important things to keep in mind is that there's a very definite grammar in Tibetan Buddhist meditation that's absolutely critical to all sectarian traditions across the board. And it sounds very, very simple, but it's really of broad significance, which is there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. And those beginnings and middles and ends are very clearly identified. They'll say, okay, this set of activities is the preliminary part of the meditation. This set of activities is the main part of the meditation. And this set of activities are the final part of the meditation. And there are stock kinds of activities that you can only put in the beginning part, or you can only put in the end part. And so that kind of grammar is very, very distinct and very normative in the context of Tibetan Buddhist meditation. And I would say if you don't have that, it's not meditation for Tibetans. I'm not saying they don't do practices, but then they'll call those practices non-meditation, or going beyond meditation, or dissolving the meditative session. So, and that's another thing, the meditative session, that is really so dominant in terms of how Tibetans think about meditation. There is a session, there's a start and a stop, and when you're doing that session, you're 100% focused on that activity. All of your attention is focused on it. And then there's this kind of notion of curricular pathways, that meditations are not isolated, but rather they're intended to be strung together into sequences, which get various names such as stages of the path and so forth. And finally, the culture of retreats, that meditation is not intended to be done in some kind of brief fashion, but rather through sustained immersive practice, as Maria was talking about in her opening presentation. So then third, we could kind of look at all these Tibetan practices, and that's what I tried to do in the slide where I talked about some of the unifying aspects of how Tibetans think about meditation. Just look at these practices on the ground, in the text, and so forth, and just ask the question, what seem to be things that we're seeing in all of these? And I offered a few thoughts of this, which is the formality of it, that there's a particular meditative session, there's this particular grammar of beginning, middle, and end. There's always a procedural script with techniques. Now, some people might bristle at that and say, oh, no, that's not true. It's totally true. It's just the procedural script might be very tightly scripted, where you have like 100 activities, every one particularly charted out with details. Or it might be that the script is very loose and has a whole lot of indeterminacy and self-emergence and spontaneity. But meditation involves a structure, even if there are moments in the meditation where it becomes quite unstructured. The fact that you're asked to bring your full undivided attention, but also that it often specifies what kind of attention do you bring to this practice? What kind of objects does it focus on? What kind of considerations shape it? The focus on monitoring your experience. This is very pervasive of Tibetan Buddhist meditation, where they're constantly asking you to watch what kinds of experiences you have and then make adjustments based upon those experiences. And then finally, last couple of points. One is, I think, Maria, in your comments, you implicitly suggested that Tibetan Buddhism some forms of Buddhist meditation in Tibet could be seen as not meditation from a normative Buddhist point of view. And there's certainly a long history of that in regards to different Asian communities talking about their vision of Buddhist meditation as normative, and kind of seeing others, other forms, and particularly Tibet, as somewhat exotic or problematic and so forth. And I think one thing there, Theravada has been one of the most problematic kind of conversations across those boundaries. But Kate Crosby's recent work on traditional Theravada meditation shows just how historically problematic that is. That historically Theravada countries engaged in forms of meditation that were very, very similar to a lot of the exact forms of Tibetan Buddhist meditation they now find so problematic. And then the last thing I'll say, of course, scientific measures is another issue that we could bring in, but that's being talked about in other contexts. The last one I'll say is that recently, and the reason I put in that slide about contemplative fluency or contemplative literacy, is I've increasingly been thinking about meditation not as a series of products, but as more of a sensibility or a capacity, like a fluency or literacy that cultures and communities can cultivate. And then that fluency and literacy can produce all sorts of different processes in very fluid, dynamic ways, just like we achieve a fluency in a language, such as English or Russian or Tibetan or Tsongkha or whatever it might be. And we don't memorize a bunch of talks to haul out at the appropriate moment. Rather, we have a generative capacity to produce contextually appropriate linguistic utterances depending upon the context we find ourselves in. And I'm increasingly thinking about meditation or contemplation along those lines, that it's more this capacity or deep generative competency that knows these different lexicons, it knows the grammars of how they can be put together, it knows the appropriate context for them to be deployed, and then depending upon the context, a very unique and distinctive form can be produced. So those are some of my initial thoughts.
And then what about prayer, for example? Prayer also have, right, some kind of literacy and fluency. You would consider it meditation according to your classification, to your approach?
Well, so there are very definite terms in Tibetan that we would probably translate in terms of prayer and so forth. And I don't think in general that Tibetans would see prayer per se as meditation, and yet prayer is often a component in meditation. And so it's one of those lexicons that go into meditative practices that you can insert here, here, and here. But something that is just 100% prayer, I mean, there probably are contemplative practices, if I thought about it, that I could look at in Tibet and see, okay, they classify this as meditation and it seems mostly to be a prayer. But I think in general, that they do see prayer as something that you can do without it being classified as meditation. But when it's modularized, then it can become a component of meditation. And that's a really important thing. Many things that we see and we think, oh, that's a meditative practice. Actually, Tibetans so intensely theorized meditation over so many centuries, they modularized many, many of those practices so that something that's a whole complex practice becomes a small module that gets inserted with other modules to form a totally different practice. And so prayer is modularized in that way.
Can we jump in with questions
Yes,
and stuff?
Sure, definitely.
So I'm just really intrigued by this idea of like a grammar or lexicon that can be kind of like flexibly configured depending on context. But I'm just curious, like, do you mean that, or I guess just to elaborate on that, but do you mean like that, for instance, like a practitioner in a non-ritualized or unstructured context would then like make use of these grammars that they've learned in more structured contexts? Or do you mean more like on a level of like a culture, or like that these grammars are kind of like deployed differently, like in like large social context? Or I don't know if I'm being clear at all, but I guess I just mean like, could you give some examples of like what that would look like?
I think you're quite clear. So I'm not so sure how well this extends to the level of just someone who's a practitioner, who's got a bunch of practices and they're doing that as such. But it definitely applies at the level of a teacher or an author or a creator of meditative practices. That we often think like, oh, what's the canonical form of this? And there is no canonical form. There are thousands of forms. Even by one author, even in one text, you'll get many forms of the same meditation. And it's a kind of, it's a red herring to be looking out for the canonical version of the practice, because there wasn't one. There was a generative expression that had certain kinds of rules to it. And within those rules, there was a vast variety of things possible. So if you, Michael, come to the teacher, she might teach this. But then 2 hours later, Lawrence comes and she might teach that, because, you know, Lawrence has a different situation. And you come back 3 weeks later and maybe she teaches you the same practice in yet a different way. Maybe it's because of you, maybe it's because of her, maybe it's because, you know, the seasons have changed or whatever it might be. And so that's what I mean, first and foremost, by a kind of generative capacity, that she knows the principle, she knows what can be varied and what can't be varied, and she can take all these things in a fluid, dynamic way, and on the spot, produce a broad variety of variations. I also think when you point to the, the cultural level or the communal level, that's also kind of why I'm thinking in this direction, to think about what it means to be a community or a culture that has this generative capacity shared across multiple teachers and understandings. To give you a few examples like you asked about, what I've been trying to do, and Michael's also involved with this project, is to look across into Tibetan canon, like take a particular practice, and then, you know, I would love to do anthropology, you know, to do some kind of ethnography of this, but I don't have that luxury of just being able to instantly fly off to 5,000 different communities and look at what they're doing on the ground. I mean, I wish I could. But what I do have is hundreds of thousands of pages in the Tibetan canon that I can read and access and see. And so I take a particular practice, and then I look at all the different versions of it across authorship, across text, across time, across sect, and I try to analyze, like, what holds all of this variation together for a single category of practice. You know, what seem to be the implicit rules that are guiding the capacity of individuals to produce all these very different instances and yet still call them dream yoga or tumo or deity yoga or calm meditation or whatever it might be. And sometimes some very interesting things come up. And I'll give you one very small example, which is there's this practice in the Tibetan canon in the 11th century in particular that's called the sounds of the elements. And the basic practice involves going out to listen to the sound of naturally occurring sounds of fire, earth, water, wind, and space. So the 5 elements according to Tibetan and Indian Buddhist elemental theory. And so, you know, looking across those, at first, I remember my first understanding was this was some kind of form of shamatha meditation, where you were using these sounds to generate a sense of concentration and focus and calm and so forth. And then as I looked across all these different aspects of it, and looking at the context in which they appeared, I started to have a completely different understanding. And we'd go far afield to talk about that, but just to give you one glimpse of it, is I realized that the goal of the practice was not really about deep states of absorption or calm, but it was about hearing the sounds of different living creatures understood to constitute the Tibetan Buddhist cosmology in these elemental sounds when you hear them really, really deeply over sustained periods of time. And that led off into a whole world about cosmologies and hearing the voices of other forms of living beings and so forth, very different from just a simple practice about cultivating a deep state of concentration on sound. And when I look at the variations, then again, I can see that, you know, what holds this practice together over time. Lawrence?
Maria, so this is really fascinating, and I think a very powerful way of rethinking some of what's going on, not becoming too fixated on individual practice, but understanding it in a kind of context, in a context of a grammar and and so on. So I want to ask a couple of related issues. So one is it possible then, if there is a grammar, to articulate the rules of that grammar or some of the structures of that grammar, and those themselves become the thing that needs to be understood from a process point of view, or from a research point of view or a scientific point of view. In others, there's a reason. You made a point earlier that there's a beginning and an end, and I think that's quite important if you're going to, particularly if you're going to experience very intense experiences that might be destabilizing or might be self-sustaining in a way that would become problematic. Having a prescribed beginning and an end is a healthy approach to entering into those and coming out of them with what you've learned. But anyway, that's a very crude, just rough response to what you said. But I just wonder if there's a way to begin to be specific about that notion of a grammar. Perhaps you started to do that with the example you just gave, that would lead to particular kinds of hypotheses that are not just on an isolated practice, but in that context. So that's my first. Let me do them separately because I'm afraid that they each deserve, and I'd love to hear a response. I have one other point after that. So let me just stop with that for a moment. If you have a response to that, David.
Yeah, I mean, that's exactly what the bigger project that we're trying to engage in is, and it's still at the beginning points. But I'll give you one example that came up that John Dunn and I had been involved in a panel back in November at Mind and Life, and he had talked a bit about transitivity, inspired by my kind of talking to him about grammar of meditation and so forth. And then when I heard him say that, I began to think in that direction as well, and it was very helpful. And so the basic issue is people often talk about practices, Tibetan Buddhist practices or other Buddhist practices that involve letting go, letting be, just natural meditation and so forth. But the reality is when you look at those practices in detail, they involve complex micro shifts of transitivity at various points. And it's not just about letting go. It's about what are you letting go and what kinds of self-emergences appear when you let go in that particular way. And you're constantly shifting back and forth between deliberate, directed activity of certain types and then letting go of certain specific, highly specific forms of directed voluntary activity, which result in highly specific forms of involuntary, automatic, effortless activity. And so these are very granular, very specific moments, not some generic let it go. So when we start to analyze the grammar in that way, we have a much more nuanced, powerful understanding of the practice than just thinking about it being letting go, which I don't know any Tibetan Buddhist meditation is just letting go.
Okay. So that brings me to my second set of points, which is when you're describing this sort of comparative, looking at many, many variations and beginning to see the structures in it, what it brought to mind right away was Levi-Strauss in the ethnographic context, looking at many different kinds of myths or stories and their relationship. And in particular, there's a little book called The Way of the Mask. I think that's what it's called, which was based actually on his experience in the University of British Columbia Ethnographic Museum, where instead of just seeing one mask and riffing off it, you can pull out drawers and see hundreds of masks that were made for ritual purposes. So it forces you right away. In effect, you're seeing a large corpus of things. You're not maybe overvaluing or overinterpreting one instance, but beginning to see the structure. But what Levi-Strauss does with that is to produce this very elaborate structural picture. These are the oppositions. These are the, these are the patterns that you can see in some kind of, almost a kind of cognitive crystallography. But another approach would be to say, in reality, these were practices, these are ritual objects that people used in ceremonies. They were produced by particular people at a particular point in time. They were in neighboring villages, they were influencing each other. And there would be a whole other way of describing where these variations were generated that is not about the sort of intrinsic, cognitive or mental or even aesthetic logic of what's going on, but actually about a social ecology, about neighbors and influences and experiments that were done and how they influenced each other. So and for me that's important, not because the genealogy is inherently important, but because it's a different generative process, and it's not about kind of Chomskyan generative grammar. It's about something much more pragmatic and much more negotiated in through practices, in effect.
Yeah, I'm a bit more sympathetic to the latter than the former.
Okay. Well, anyway, we'll come back to it, because for me, that what's important about that is it means that when we want to characterize a practice, we probably also have to characterize it socially, not just at the level of grammar. And I guess the other analogy and the other thought, final thought, is that one of the alternatives to the sort of Chomsky generative grammar is a more semantically based grammar that Lakoff sort of proposed, in a sense that the structure of language is really about extended metaphors. And for example, words that are close to each other in a sentence have more influence in each other. They're experienced as influencing each other more just because of a kind of analogical structure of how information is coming in, and so on and so forth. So then something like letting go, but I mean, it's a bit dangerous to do that in translation, but within Tibetan and whatever that term is, would have its own forms of extension that follow a metaphoric logic in some ways. But that's maybe, and again, it can turn that into a question to you, because you are also dealing with a highly, what's the word, highly formalized and highly structured and systematized system. So does that mean that the metaphoric extensions are really not the primary logic, that they're reined in and they're kept, they're in the service of another kind of structure?
I mean, it all depends on which kinds of meditative practice you're looking at. In many, that's exactly what's happening. And in others, it's very clear that the metaphorical logic of extension is being deliberately, intentionally, explosively used in a way that produces this polysemy of associations and so forth that become the guiding logic of the practice. So that again goes back to this issue of the multiple uses of, or the multiple ways in which Tibetans understood meditation, often at complete odds with each other, and really came into great conflict. And just maybe I'll stop talking, share one point about language. If you look at the language of Tibetan Buddhist text, this is a little bit of a stereotype, so I'm not going to name traditions or authors, but there's one way of looking at language where it's almost like you take a lasso and you catch each word in that lasso and you just pull it as tight as humanly possible to squeeze every inch of vitality and association out of that word and say, here's how we define the word. And it produces a certain kind of text, and it's associated with certain kinds of meditation. And then there are other texts that say, no interest in a lasso whatsoever. And we're interested in deconstructing these words into their component parts and setting them free for vibration. And their practices are very different in character. So, yeah.
Thank you.
We have one question from audience. So the question is how you see the future of contemplative sciences, taking into account that Western population do not capable to practice these practices in the real original context. So everything is simplified. And how important this context and how contemplative sciences can kind of continue without this detailed context original included in these practices.
Well, I've been talking, so maybe Geoffrey can start with that one.
Yeah, I was actually thinking of some things about Lawrence's question, but yeah, well, I think, looking at this a little, both historically and across the contemporary practice world, as it were, in Tibet, I think a lot of the highly complex structures within which, say, something like deity yoga might be performed in in a group setting today, where you do have this very elaborate structure of different phases, including prayers and homages and mantras and whatever, it's itself the result of a historical development in which it would seem at least possible that at earlier stages things were much simpler. And it's also part of a contemporary situation in which the same practice can be done in a variety of different ways, some of which are more complex and simpler. One of the things that I've been a bit involved in has been working on some of the rituals in the Terma tradition. For example, some of you will know I've done some work on a long life practice of the Dudra Rinpoche tradition. And there you have a body of texts which give, which is very, I mean, absolutely characteristic of the whole term genre, it seems, where you get short versions, you get middle versions, you get long versions, you get accessory things which can be put in and left out. You get ways in which it can be constructed for particularly, in which the central idea, if you like, or concept of the practice and central visualization can be constructed for a particular context. And then when you actually look at what's happening ethnographically, so in the context of an extended meditation session, you find that all sorts of other things get added in which aren't in the text anyway. So, which comes back, I think, to some of what David was saying about the generative possibilities. That a community of practitioners and teachers will in fact, will never actually probably do the same thing twice, though the differences may vary in how significant they are. And I mean, for me, that is somewhat hopeful, I think, in terms of the ongoing viability of the tradition. It's been practiced in a whole lot of different contexts so far. I think that insofar as there are real physiological processes and mental processes that we can identify and that the Tibetans can identify, and this seems to be the case, that there is no reason why they can't find ways, or whoever it is that's doing this, because I think it's increasingly a cross-cultural project, can't find ways to bring about these transformations in different situations. So I'm not saying it will be easy, but I think this has already happened historically many different times, particularly when the practice came from India to Tibet, which is, I think, a drastic change in context and environment. So from that point of view, I don't feel so negative here.
Yeah, I think for me, this has been more the last 11 years of my life is focused on these kinds of challenges since I turned my professional attention back to the US and focusing on these issues of contemplation and its possible utility within educational context. And so just 4 points, which I think echo what Geoffrey was saying. The first thing is procedures are problematic. If we focus on meditation in terms of procedural instructions, we're always going to go astray because we didn't really understand the practice. And the reason for that is the context in which these practices were historically situated or are situated today are so rich, so complex, and so centrally constituent of the practice. If all we do is look at the procedures without a deep understanding of the broader context through participation or ethnography or understanding of the literature and so forth, we just don't even get the practice to start with. And then so secondly, this led me to a focus on thinking it's not really about translating procedures, it's about translating across worlds that are incommensurable in so many ways. To go from 18th century Tibet to 21st century United States, for example, you're moving across worlds, and those worlds shape those practices. And then third, that's what got me thinking about generative competency. It was really not so much my scholarship, but more puzzling over a decade around this question of how do we think about these practices and whether they have significance or utility for a totally different context. And I think the more nuanced, granular, and expansive we understand the original practice and the worlds of social relationships and environmental relationships and so many other relationships in which that practice made sense, the more we understand that in nuanced ways, the more capable we are of participating in some type of design process which envisions, in this context, let's say an elementary school in Louisville, Kentucky, or a clinic in Boston, Massachusetts, some design process that envisions a changed configuration of practices, people, ideas, relationships in that context. And I think for that to happen, you really have to know and to love the world in which you're trying to design a practice. So when people who don't love and know that world, the clinic, the elementary school, whatever it might be, they just know meditation and they try to design something, I really don't see how that's ever going to work. You have to know the fabric of that world you're designing to, not just the fabric of some world that you're designing from.
And then I have another question related, because I spent like several weeks in retreat center in Bhutan, Gyaltsen Rinpoche Center, and I was watching these monks meditating in a very complex, context with all these, all these context elements. And my thought was, maybe because they're so like heavily context oriented and traditional, they're not very suitable for modern people, even Bhutanese or Tibetan. So do you think if we can really take these main elements of physiological mental processes behind, could these practices be adapted more to Western context, and whether it would be a positive step forward?
So the question was about leaving behind the context and focusing on cognitive?
Maybe adapted more to Western context, whether it's even, because it's really, for modern people, even Bhutanese, Tibetan, it already doesn't speak to them, so you think it's still possible somehow to develop, take these main elements and change the context. So maybe this is really not a bad thing to change it more to Western, while leaving the same main elements there.
Yeah, so that's what I was talking about, but in my answer to the previous question. But I'll also point to what Geoffrey was saying, which is, there never has been a status quo. There never was. There wasn't in India, there wasn't in Tibet, and we can look at these big junctures when it went from India to Tibet or India to China, but even in Tibet, how it negotiates, the centuries, you have astonishing transformations and practices. And so when you talk to a teacher today, like any teacher of a tradition, he or she might say, oh, this is how you do this practice. Well, I can show you that that's not how they did that practice 500 years ago. And so they were changing all the time. So, I mean, how much more obvious does it have to be that if we're going to move it to a totally different cultural context in the 21st century, we're going to have to change it dramatically? I think that just should go without saying.
I think, though, it's also true that it maybe also goes without saying that we need to be fairly careful about how we do it, since the question of what is the central element here or what are the central elements is always something that's a bit up for grabs. I mean, to come back to this question of the definition of meditation, in Maria's recorded lecture, you talking about the Bhutanese study, you end up with a suggestion that we define meditation as a technique to enhance control over the autonomic nervous system. And clearly at some level, that's what's going on in your experimental situation. If you listen to what the lamas say on the two recordings, that's clearly not what they see as the goal of the practice. So I think there's always this kind of shift. I mean, we've seen this with all the mindfulness-based interventions where, something has happened, something has been transmitted. Arguably, what is taking place in the Western context is significantly different from anything that was happening in the Asian context. Does that matter or does it not matter? So I think just to say that this is not a simple process, and I think the kind of work that we're doing here, and that this conference is perhaps an early stage in many ways, still, is probably very important for it, because it helps us to begin to identify what it is we're really working with here, and what the implications of taking one element of that and working with it might be. Anyway.
And I think along those lines, when you look at Tibet or Bhutan, this was an entire culture that was mutually reinforcing, like incredible art, philosophy, poetry, behaviors, communities, social relationships, institutions, practices. They were all mutually articulating each other and so forth. And so to just take out one piece and think that without that great tradition or that great communal cultural investment, you're going to have the same resonance. I mean, that's not going to happen. And also I think that any great tradition is a combination of limitations and freedoms. And if you just, a California weekend where you're not limited by anything, that also means you're not committed to anything. And I think that's a problematic way to consider how to adapt these practices and traditions. It's like a conversation. We have certain commitments and limitations, and that allows us to talk to each other.
Quick question there, and obviously for myself, I know very little outside of medicine and perhaps scientific inquiry into the practice. Could the scientific inquiry itself provide a distilling process that allow us to first distinguish what's going on, and then allow a better adaptation of that part that we distill through science, like stuff that Maria have done or whatever. So you can apply scientific inquiry, figure out what's going on, and then use it as a testing tube for adaptation, pragmatic adaptation into the Western culture. So the simple example would be if I can increase blood flow to my brain, well, that's objectively measurable. And can we define practice through the end result physiologically? Which will allow you to some degree to disengage from the cultural context, but it's also a good pragmatic way to adopt something. Did I make myself clear?
Yeah, yes, I think so.
I have maybe a comment to add to that, along this same vein, because I think there's an analogy to what we're talking about and what happens in cross-cultural work when people try to culturally adapt an intervention. And there's a large literature on that, on adapting cognitive behavior therapy to another situation. And in that process, people have to decide what are the crucial aspects of the intervention that have to be preserved in some way. And that can be articulated, as you just mentioned, in terms of some underlying process, that's what you're really trying to make sure that process happens. And maybe there's a different way to make it happen for different people in different situations. But it can also be an outcome. So you might even say, okay, we have a certain outcome we want to get to, and we're going to use a totally different process because that process isn't appropriate for this person in that situation. And there are arguments about those levels. And so the latter, this sort of saying, well, we have the same goal, but we're going to do it completely differently, leads to much more profound shifts in what people are doing. And I think that you have exactly this debate going on. The only caveat in all this is, and this is the problem with sort of this dismantling and so on, is that in reality, every intervention, and I'm sure every meditative practice, does many, many different things. Some that are intended, some that we might be interested in because of our own tools or our own training, and others of which we're not paying attention to. And that is something that is framed by a lot of assumptions that may or may not be warranted. So I think that's a bit of the, David put in the largest picture there, aesthetic and moral things going on, all kinds of things which might not be at all incidental to what's beneficial in a practice for people. So yes, there might be more brain blood flow, but that actually might not be, that might be a byproduct or not a necessary element of what, what is effective for people. Anyway, just to say, I think that the analogy is useful because people have struggled with this, but then the conclusion is it's actually extremely complicated issue with many possible solutions in terms of, what that transformation would look like.
Yeah, I think it's fine to do, Alexander, what you suggested, if that's what you want to do. But but then if we take that to use it as somehow that this is the primary way we should use to assess these pragmatic adaptations into new cultures, then I would have the reservations of what Lawrence said. So if what you want to do is increase blood flow to the brain, and that's your only interest and your chief interest, and you're trying to figure out some personal practice that can substitute for something that people typically use medication for, then that seems okay to me. But if what you're trying to do is understand what these people are doing with this practice and figure out what their outcomes were, and then consider how those outcomes could be replicated in our culture, like then that is a much more complicated question. And I don't think that science is anywhere near having the capacity to be the primary gatekeeper for that process. It could be a contributing agent in that process if used in a skillful, intelligent way with other kinds of knowledge and other kinds of inquiry. But I feel like personally in the field of contemplative studies or contemplative sciences, we seem still pretty far away from that. It still seems like people are in their disciplinary locks, and I wish we could get over that.
Yeah, but it's also that we have practically no scientific inquiry. It's in such a remarkable, for many reasons, it's in such a remarkably primordial state that it's tough to say if it was ever given any chance whatsoever.
I think Michael had a question. Oh, a comment.
Michael?
Yeah, although there's a loud car alarm outside my window, so I'm sorry for that. But I guess I'm just interested, I feel like it's worth mentioning. I'm curious what you would think about all of the kind of, for instance, Tibetan Buddhist teachers who have come from a Tibetan context or an Indian context and kind of brought that Dharma to the West, and in particular ways where they've already kind of, like they have some kind of version of explaining what they take to be the essence of their practice and how they think that Westerners might relate to that. So there's this already, you know, like there's a kind of agency from within the tradition of bringing it to a different context. I don't know, I guess just like how is that, do you see that as kind of entwined in the way that then scientists try to do that same move basically, but from the other side? Like, how do you see those different kind of agendas as coming together?
Well, I think maybe two things. One is if you look at the range of things that Tibetan lamas have done outside Tibet, there have been all kinds of strategies varying from doing it more or less by the book, the way they've done it back in Tibet, to drastic simplifications, condensations, transformations, which is not surprising. I mean, the role of a lama, I think, is such that people have a great deal of autonomy. But another thing here is that in the transmission from India to Tibet, there was very much a sense of collaboration and cooperation between people on both sides. The idea that you had Indian scholars and you had Tibetan scholars and translators and working together. And I think, I mean, that's obviously already happening to some extent in this situation. It seems to me that Western science is part of what the Western science side has to bring to this process. And it makes perfect sense for that to happen. But I noticed that Wangdrak Rinpoche is now online with us, so maybe he has something to say here, because I know he is very interested in some of these issues.
Thank you very much, everyone, for discussion in these panels. And Geoffrey and David, thanks a lot. And I will just need to log out and then log in few minutes because of some Zoom problems here for Rinpoche sessions, and I hope to see you there in few minutes. So thanks again for the panel.